Welcome back to another episode of the Lake Protectors Podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay Canay, and today we have with us one of our very own, the Lake George Waterkeeper, Chris Navitsky. Chris, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm looking forward to being here and talking.
Well, we appreciate it, and we're going to talk about salt. But first, we want to get a little bit of your background. So how did you come to be the Lake George Waterkeeper?
I've been the waterkeeper for about 23 years.
Okay.
My background is environmental engineering, and I worked in professional consulting for about 17 years. Always with a mindset to try to protect waters, working on wastewater treatment plants, stormwater projects, stormwater permitting. But after a while, I found out I was working more for developers, and I felt not doing what I thought was needed to protect water. We were destroying our environment more, I felt. So I had, through discussions with Lynn Schumann, who is the director of the Lake George Land Conservancy, she informed me at the time the Fund for Lake George was seeking a waterkeeper. And I was like, what is a waterkeeper?
Yeah.
A lot of people imagine that. But I did some research and I applied, and in 2002, I became the Lake George Waterkeeper. So that's my background. It's part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, which is an international organization that protects waters to make waters fishable, swimmable, and drinkable. There's about 320 waterkeepers around the world on 5 continents. The Lake George Waterkeeper was the 85th program. So with that, I take science, data, and research, engineering principles, and the enforcement of existing laws, and use that to protect our water quality for the good of Lake George and its community.
So Lake George was pretty early on in the Waterkeeper.
Yeah, actually, this year is the 25th year of the Waterkeeper movement. So it was started in the Hudson River with the Hudson River Keeper.
Okay.
John Cronin was the first river keeper, waterkeeper. From there, they moved out to the Long Island Sound, San Francisco Bay Keeper, and then just started growing, primarily in the United States initially, and then it started becoming an international movement. And it is the largest movement to protect the waters of the world, which really, if you think about it, that's where all communities really start. They start along waters and rivers. So water's important to all our communities, especially Lake George. We know how important it is, how it's the economic engine, how it really brings an important quality of life to us, and that's why we're here.
And we're lucky to have you here.
Oh, thank you.
So we're going to talk about salt, but you know, everyone knows salt. We're, of course, going into winter season where salt will be applied to roads. But what is the issue with salt? Why is salt problematic?
Salt is a problem for several reasons. It is a tool that is needed. There is a benefit, and we're not saying that it should not be used, but we need to use it wisely, and it needs to be one of the many tools or practices that we use, and that's the way we really promote it. So we're not anti-salt. We want it to be used in a wise and efficient manner, which I think through consultants that we've worked with, such as WIT advisors and other people, we've learned a lot, and we like to educate our local highway departments as well as contractors. So some of the problems with salt is that salt is just like table salt. It's sodium chloride.
Right.
When it breaks down into sodium and chloride, the chloride is conservative. And when we say conservative, is that it doesn't bind to any other materials like this. The sodium will actually bind to soils and adhere to soils, similar to the way like nutrients do, like phosphorus binds. But chloride doesn't. And that leads to a problem because it doesn't go away in the environment. Once it's in the environment, it continues to accumulate and increase its concentrations. So that's a problem. We're seeing that chloride also creates denser water. So when chloride's in water, it changes the characteristics of water. Water becomes more dense, and that upsets the natural cycle of how lakes actually act the way they naturally turn over. There's a great study that was done actually by Dr. Brennan Wiltsey, the new executive director of the LGA, who studied Mirror Lake. And Mirror Lake up in Lake Placid actually wasn't turning over because there was so much salt in the lower layers that it wouldn't turn over. And that's a problem to flush the lake, to bring oxygen to the deeper waters, good for fisheries. So you can see how that has an impact to the fisheries. Chloride actually is a contaminant. It can upset the ecosystem. There's a fine balance between the zooplankton and phytoplankton, as you well know from the work on the floating classroom.
Yeah.
Zooplankton can be affected by chloride, so their numbers can decrease. The zooplankton graze on the phytoplankton, so zooplankton numbers go down, phytoplankton goes up. It can actually do algae blooms, something you wouldn't associate with that. We are also seeing through some of the studies that we've done, as well as studies of the Adirondack Watershed Institute, that chlorides can accumulate in our groundwater and impact our drinking water to a level that there are spots in the Adirondacks where people have contaminated wells and their interior plumbing fixtures, their dishwashers, things like that, have actually corroded and fallen apart. Another problem, you think about Flint, Michigan, the problem when they had the lead released into the water system was they had lead pipes, chloride. They started taking surface water, using that in their water systems. The chloride leached the lead out, and that led to the lead poisoning. So there's numerous concerns that we have with chlorides, from impacts to our infrastructure, to impacts to health, to impacts to the ecosystem. So.
Yeah, and I learned about the Mirror Lake turnover. I saw that presentation at the Salt Summit this year, which was great. Lake George turns over twice a year. It's a dimictic lake. Was Mirror Lake also a lake that turns over twice?
Yes.
And it just completely stopped.
It stopped because, and Brendan has a great analogy. You think about oil and vinegar, like Italian dressing.
Right.
And the way it takes energy to mix the two.
Right.
Well, it takes energy to mix the lake, to take those denser waters and turn that over. And if the waters become too dense, the lake doesn't have the natural energy to turn itself over.
And it would become somewhat stagnant if it's not getting that.
It's stagnant. And then you think about when the summers come, where do the cold water fisheries go?
Yeah.
They go to the deeper waters. But if the lake doesn't turn over, those deeper waters become hypoxic, lacking oxygen. So therefore, we're taking area of the lake away from where these fish natural habitat are.
Especially in our deep Lake George.
Yes.
For our deep water fish.
Now, we haven't nearly reached that level in Lake George. The concerns, we've been studying chlorides in Lake George since 1980, which is an important date. We'll get back to that.
Okay.
Since 1980, the levels in Lake George have tripled. And that's primarily tied to road salt. You think 1980, the Adirondacks, what happened? It was the Olympics.
Right.
When the Olympics came, they wanted to make sure the roads were clear. So they went from more sand to road salt to make sure the roads were clear. And that's when we got into our fixation with using a lot of road salt.
Well, and just travel. I think there's this expectation with people, and I know Phil Sexton of WIT Advisors always mentions it, like you don't have to go out in the middle of a snowstorm for XYZ. Some people do. Obviously, there's emergency workers. There are people that it is necessary for them to be on the road. It needs to be passable for them, but like you don't have to, be out and about if you don't need to. But I think there's somewhat of a demand for that. The expectation is, well, I can go out on this road.
Expectation is an important aspect. When we're talking about, and what we refer to as sustainable winter management, people's expectations need to be part of the equation, need to be discussed. You know, we live in the Adirondacks. It is winter. You know, winter tires are an important thing. You don't need to drive 55, 60 miles an hour on every road.
No.
And as you said, maybe you don't need to go out to get that gallon of milk or to go out to dinner if we're having a snowstorm, and allow the people who really are kind of our local heroes, our highway departments, put themselves in danger a lot. You know, so that we can travel to work, we can travel to the stores or wherever we want to go. So.
Whether it be Thanksgiving Day, Christmas, like any,
at
any
out.
point they're out and they're hustling to get the roads.
So expectations is an important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, salt levels tripling in the last 40 years. That's pretty scary. But I know here in Lake George, like, we've made a lot of strides. You know, in particular, have led the way on that. So why don't we talk about that a little bit? Like what we're doing here in Lake George around the watershed to help mitigate these increasing salt levels.
Well, where it all started, you know, it's interesting that the Lake George Road Salt Reduction Initiative actually came out of the invasive species work that we did. So
in the boat inspection stations?
Well, when we got together with the local elected officials and the businesses to promote and advocate for the boat inspection program, that was initiated through a group called the Save Lake George Partnership, Stop Aquatic Invasives Entering Lake George. So we got together with all the elected officials, the LGA, the fund at the time was there, some businesses, Warren County supervisors, and we worked with the Lake George Park Commission and New York State to implement the inspection program. That started with an MOU that we all got on the same page and said that this was important for our economy, it was important for the vitality of the lake, and that we needed to invest in this program. And we were successful getting the inspection program, which is one of the best programs that the Park Commission has put in.
Yeah.
While we were at the table, we were like, and this follows up on the 30-year study that the fund put together with the Darren Freshwater Institute. Invasive species was a critical issue to Lake George.
Right.
Road salt was, and what we called water quality and clarity, or nutrient loading, stormwater, sewer. So we felt we were at the table, we addressed invasives, let's look at road salt. So we took that same core group that we had, the elected officials, the supervisors, used that same model, developed an MOU, had that adopted by all the municipalities around the watershed, just as we did with invasive species. And with that, we said we're going to work towards implementing a program to reduce road salt. We're going to do it in a manner that we are going to bring experts and equipment to work with the highway department. We'll be guided by science. We will look to get grants and bring that money in to help our towns and our municipalities. And we will host an annual road salt summit to bring these experts in. So we were all on the same page. That was started in 2015.
Okay.
And 2025 will be our 10th anniversary, and we're excited about that. So it was all started with the municipalities, and we implemented a program that focused on 6 practices. It was measuring, calibrating, preventing, analyze, optimize, and improve. Okay. So really, we started with the highway departments, and it was a change for them. It was a change in their use, and they, again, we talked about how hard they work under difficult situations, and that's what they were used to. They were used to opening their gates this much and pouring salt out.
It.
And that's what, so we wanted to train them better. So we started by putting black boxes, we call them black boxes, but tracking units in their trucks. So if you want to reduce, the only way you can reduce, you have to know how much you're putting down. So that was measuring. So we started with measuring. That wasn't easy. They were thinking that Big Brother was looking over their shoulder, and they weren't going to do it. So it took a lot of meetings. It took a lot of donuts. We would go to the municipal garages and talked to them, and it took a lot of investment at the time too, because we purchased this equipment, the trackers. Another big thing that happened to really kick this off was something called the live edge plow.
Yes.
We had a relationship developed with Metal Plus, which is a company out of Canada, and instead of having a straight 12-foot blade on the bottom, which doesn't conform to these rough roads in the Adirondacks.
Or just like the curvature.
Exactly. Yes. Natural.
Especially going over mountains, hills.
Exactly. The roads are super elevated.
Yeah.
You have a crown in the road. We have potholes everywhere. We have the tire tracks. So they had blades that were 6 2-foot blades. So you may not be as familiar, but it's similar to when you shave. You get those multiple blades, and it conforms to the surface better. So it's more effective and efficient at removing the snow off the road. And the snow on the road builds up into ice, and that's when you've got a problem, and you start pouring the salt on, and you use what we always called the moron approach. You keep putting more on and more on. So if we can be more effective and efficient at removing the snow off the road, that brings us down to bare pavement where we want to be. So, and the other thing with the live edge plows is that they were flexible so that they could actually conform and remove the snow more efficiently. So we started getting those around 2015, 16, and we gave them to a few towns, and all of a sudden the lights went on, and they were resistant at first, but then with the tracking device, we could actually see, we put it with one truck on one route, and we saw that they dropped their salt application by 25%. We then switched different routes, and we put it on another truck, a different driver, different route. His salt reduction went down 25%. And the first route actually went up when they didn't have the live edge plow. So the numbers were there, as we always like to say, science to solutions. So we were actually using that with road salt. Then the drivers got it. And, once you get them understanding it, we stood back a little bit, and we let the drivers talk to each other. And they started convincing each other. It was really the town of Lake George at the time. Dan Davies was the highway superintendent. Dan Davis, I'm sorry. And Rob Velopoulos, who was a young guy, younger. These younger guys are a little more tech savvy, computer savvy. They could work on such things as that modeling that goes along with the tracking device, putting in apps to track things, actually putting in cameras. We would put cameras on the side of the road. Again, people were a little hesitant, concerned. They're like, why are you tracking
a camera
with a camera? Invasive to people's
little.
But we were just focusing on the road. And we would take pictures every 15 minutes. And we could actually compare where they had the live edge plows, and then we started moving into brining, where they had the brining, in how that treated roads, how the roads reacted, where it was treated and where there wasn't. And we could compare the roads, the same conditions, where there was brine, where there wasn't, where there was live edge plow, where there wasn't. And, when we started building that up, the momentum just started going. And the town of Lake George, the town of Hague really became leaders, and it took off. So it was really back then, that's when it started. We owe a lot to our partners at WIT Advisors, Phil Sexton. And as we like to say, we started a model that started to get recognized through our road salt summits that we used to have. We started moving them around. Instead of the Lake George Salt Summit, we started calling it the Adirondack Champlain Regional Summit. Held it up in Lake Placid, and the word got out. So that's kind of how it started.
And even last year's was in Lake George, but like folks from the town of Peru, 2+ hours away, were coming down. I thought it was so interesting. I went to the one last year as well, of course, the amount of savings, like, of course, the town guys, you get them on board because they're actually on the ground doing the work. But then when you see how much you're saving as far as salt goes, yes, you have to pay for technology, but that lasts obviously much longer than a one-time usage. We dumped all this salt on the road and now it's gone.
Great point.
The numbers, like they actually, they're bringing the real number data and presenting it, and it's like they're saving
absolutely
thousands of dollars for these towns that can go back into road maintenance or whatever it may be. But
yeah, the ROI, return on investment, is, and that's another thing we like to use. We think it's good to show our investments, people's investment in our work is doing benefits. And, we had goals of reducing road salt application by 50%. And we've achieved that in a few of the towns.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And I live in the town of Hague, and they actually reduced their road salt application by 50%. That wound up being $65,000 out of their highway department. So Live Edge,
small town.
yeah, and
Big towns are
so you take that to other towns like town of Queensbury and whatnot, where they have a lot higher number of roads. But we found that it was about 3 years that it would take to recoup your investment, so your return on investment to break even. So Live Edge plows were more expensive, about twice the cost of standard plows. But again, you can see how you start to recoup that. The brining, which has been very important to get out ahead of the storm. And why is brining? That's the third practice when we said prevent. We mean to prevent the buildup of ice, anti-icing. So brining is similar to when you cook. You spray your pan so that your food doesn't stick. Well, that's what you do with brine, is that you spray the road, and it does two things. It initially melts that first bit of snow that hits the road, and that's actually saved highway departments an hour in the morning from going out first thing. So instead of them having to go out at 4 in the morning, they can come in at 5 in the morning. When they're working those long shifts, that means a lot. And also, it's easier to scrape and clear that road off because it's not sticking, it's not building up, it's not getting compacted and turning into ice, where that's where the problems start. So yes, it's a big savings, and it goes a long way in these small towns.
How long before a storm can crews get out and start brining? Like, what's the shelf life, I guess, on a road? You see them out, they're dropping the liquid on the road lines.
Great.
But, like, is that a 2-day?
You can start going about
or the weather.
Yeah, it's usually about 24 to 48 hours ahead.
Okay.
And as you said, it's when you see those white lines down the travel lanes, that's what it is. But it is very weather dependent. You don't want to put that down and when there's rain coming, because then rain will wash it off. So that's another important thing. Good point that you raised, is to educate these highway departments on weather, to use weather forecasting, to understand the weather, understand the moisture content, take the pavement temperatures. Very important, especially in these hilly areas where, I drive over Tongue Mountain every day, and it can be a world of difference at the top of the mountain from the bottom. So they've understood how things change, how snow will accumulate, and how it won't. So weather is very important, but it's about 24 hours is what you want to do to get it out. The other thing that we've learned is as they use salt, and salt is one of the tools, you notice through the winter that the roads become whiter and whiter.
Oh, yeah.
And we've actually worked with departments that do assessments of the roads in between storms and note when there's a lot of salt buildup on the road. And that's almost like a brine as it is.
Right.
So the roads are already coated, so they make notes of that and actually will hold back on brining because the roads
It's
already
basically been treated.
Yep, absolutely.
I thought it was so interesting too last year at the Salt Summit. I don't remember which municipality it was, but it was one of the panels. And they were talking about how for whatever particular year they had a different mixture when they repaved a road. But then the following winter, they realized that it was so much better as far as the removal of snow. Like whatever that pavement mixture was when they repaved, it just functioned much better. I don't know if it was allowing the brine to sink in or whatever it may be, but there's so many things that can still be done and like still learning, adapting.
Absolutely.
And
I was on the governor's Adirondack Road Salt Task Force, and one of the task force members was Tracy Eldridge from Hamilton County, the highway superintendent there. And he stressed about the importance of investing in paving our roads because it makes it so much easier to remove the snow. And that's one of the things that New York State DOT, who has partnered with us over the years on this, when they actually repaved Route 9N, they did that in part to help reduce road salt so that it was easier to remove, easier for the plows to get a cleaner scrape. Down to bare pavement, and that definitely reduces the amount of road salt that they put on.
Yeah, chunky roads aren't helping any.
No, and I mean, unfortunately, that's part of the living up here in the Adirondacks and how the roads break up in the freeze-thaw cycle. And unfortunately, you think about how winters are changing here a little bit, and that may become a greater problem. We're getting a little bit more ice.
A lot, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say a lot more ice.
And we're also getting more rain events in the wintertime. I've looked and done studies, and, about a third of our precipitation events in the winter now are rain events. And the water gets into those little cracks, minuscule, microscopic cracks in the pavement, freeze and thaw cycles.
And then it just pops apart.
So that could be a problem.
Yeah. And I know up north, just in traveling around, sometimes you do go on roads that like maybe the storm was a couple days before, but there's dense, thick layers of ice. Would that be because maybe they didn't brine or maybe they, not to say they haven't applied enough salt, but like, is it just that cold?
Well, a couple of things, and we've been working with DOT on that, was actually part of the maintenance is how they handle the roads. We talked about the paving, but it's also the cutting back of the vegetation. And we know that that's a touchy thing in the Adirondacks, but the plow operator's best friend is sun. When sun gets to the road, that is when the roads become clear and dry. So if we can cut back the canopy, and they've actually looking at using GIS in areas where the roads, there's an abundance of shade, and where they can cut that back a little. We're not saying clear cut along the roads, but selective trimming. And the other thing is knowing where your cold areas are, where the sun doesn't hit the road due to, embankments or road cuts. These highway guys know their roads. They know those 20 miles on their beat, their route, as they call it. So they know where they can spot salt. And I've actually followed the state highway trucks.
Sure you have.
And just on my general commute into work, not that I'm spying, but you see how they spot treat now.
Yeah.
And that way they're not running their hopper the entire time, but when they come into those areas where the sun may not hit, they may put down a little salt and not salt the entire route. So, and that's where they've learned, and it's an education process. It all gets back to education.
It always is. It's always a build. All right, so we've talked a lot about what municipalities have done, the amazing work they're doing with their town crews, but what can businesses, homeowners, listeners do for their businesses, their homes? What options do they have?
That's a great question. Because studies through SIMA, which is a Snow and Ice Management Association, that's a partner with us, helped us with our salt summit, say that half of the road salt application is on the private properties.
Wow.
And we focused on public. But private is where we've been putting a bit of focus on. And I will admit we haven't been as successful. It takes a bit to get to them. Part of what we've been trying to do is reach out to private contractors, educate them. It's always difficult to get them to the salt summits where they can learn a lot because the private contractors are winter maintenance people, but during warmer weathers, they tend to be landscape and they're always busy when we have our salt summit. So it's been trouble getting them there. We worked with the town of Lake George, provided them a grant, the LGA did, to get a brine maker to catalyze and initiate a brining co-op that the town of Lake George would make brine available to people in the private sector, our businesses, the resorts, private contractors, possibly homeowners. That was started last year in 2023. This year, we are going to be having our first workshop for the co-op. So we're excited and hopefully this will start that going. We are actually working with a couple contractors now who are starting brining on private roads on homeowners association. So it's taken a while, but we're excited about that. So we're seeing some movement. But for homeowners, it's almost the same approach that we talked about for the public. You think about mechanically removing. So how can you clean your area? You want to plow, you want to shovel and clear that off. You don't want to just rely. So really try to get to that pavement. Where you do have areas that you're concerned with salt or concerned with ice, they say like a cup, a coffee cup of salt can cover, several hundred square feet. So you don't need a lot to dump it on. You don't need to hear it crunch under your feet like popcorn. Again, I talked earlier, it's the moron approach. You see a few of these stores where they just dump literally piles of salt. And you don't need that. Again, it's, there's a big concern about liability and slip and falls, and that's legitimate, but you don't need that much salt to remove the snow and prevent ice from building up.
So one little coffee cup. I used to be guilty of it, I will say. I used to take one of those shakers and shake a path for myself. Because I didn't want to fall.
Right. But it really, if you see and you see those clumps of salt and how that really melts away. But if, again, you think about it, another thing is where you store your snow once you remove it. You don't want to put it on the uphill side of your driveway because what happens?
It will melt down and freeze.
Come back up and freeze. So, things like that. We actually, at this past Salt Summit, actually brought in an engineer to talk about how you bring these ideas into a site design, your parking lot design.
Oh, yeah, that was a great
this was something that, it's a lot of it's common sense, but stuff that you're not really thinking of. So again, mechanically removing, whether that's plowing, shoveling, again, move it to areas that are on the low side so that
sun is your friend.
Melt. Sun is your friend. That's your best friend.
Yeah.
So
and be more strategic. I think there's a frantic nature when it comes to this snowstorm is here, whatnot, but generally we have a pretty good heads up.
Yeah. I always have a theory that this is driven by the supermarkets. They invest and want you to go out and buy the milk and bread. And that's why they threaten these storms. But, in seriousness, good tires, again, I think is so important. And, think about when you have to travel. Again, it gets back to what we talked about earlier, expectations. And just be cognizant of what you're doing, how you maintain your property, where you push it. And then when you do have ice, again, salt is a tool, but use it sparingly. And again, think of that shaker approach or that cup for just several hundred feet.
Not the whole shaker.
Not the whole,
We talked about sand very briefly, but do you ever recommend sand?
Yeah, sand is another tool. Sand, people don't realize that Lake George is an impaired water body, and that's due to sediment. And a lot of that was tied to the sand that was used prior to road salt. We actually got a little pushback the environmental community, from the state highway departments and local municipalities, because they were using sand, and we were saying, stop using sand. It's building up deltas. It's clogging up streams, impacting wildlife, the fisheries. So they moved to salt, and then all of a sudden now we're saying don't use salt, and they're like, what can we do?
Right.
What is it with you environmentalists? But it's all, again, we talk about education, and that's one of the important things about the Salt Summit, and training people on better equipment, better applications, knowing how you're using it. So sand is important, especially as we alluded to earlier about the changing winter. What do you use when you get ice storms? Well, sand will give you traction during those periods when we have one of those ice storms of concern and significance. That'll give you traction for those periods. Little grit, and until that salt can go in. The other thing with sand, when they were using sand, it wasn't just sand, it was salt, because sand will freeze. So to prevent the sand from freezing, what did you do? You added salt. Now, typically, and we'll talk numbers really briefly, we shoot for around 150 to 200 pounds of salt per lane mile, just kind of an average.
Okay.
When they were using sand, they were putting down closer to 700 to 800 pounds.
In a 1 mile stretch?
In a 1 mile stretch.
Both sides of the road?
When we say lane mile, it is
just one
lane.
Oh my gosh.
But they added 5 to 10% of that was salt to prevent the sand from freezing. Do the math. So if you've got 700 pounds being added, 10% of that, 20% of that is salt. That's 70 to 140 pounds of salt, even when you're adding the sand.
That's absurd.
And some towns are actually using a 50-50 mix, which through our discussions with wood advisors was actually the least effective amount and the worst thing that you could do. And that was one of the ways that when we started working with towns to have them reduce their road salt was to actually change that salt sand mixture and get away from the 50-50 mix. If they went down to a 90-10, right there, they're saving, 40% of salt reducing. So
in a steep watershed like Lake George, where do these municipalities store their big snow piles? Like when they're removing it from a parking lot or wherever, like where are they putting it?
Well, I remember the village of Lake George years ago, when they had to clear all their downtown streets.
Yeah, like where does it go?
Well, they used to move it up near where the rec fields were,
which
just happened to be right next to Westbrook. Yes. And we worked with Mayor Blaze, and Mayor Blaze was just such a great person to work with.
Yeah.
He was a leader in our road salt reduction initiative. And we spoke with him, and he's like, "You're right. We got to find a different area," and they did. So, that's, again, getting back to that common sense we talked about earlier, things like storage. But with the steep roads, the main thing is to try to clear the roads so that they can be safe. And I didn't say this until this point, but the main thing is that we need to maintain safe roads throughout all this. And we were very fortunate through the Road Salt Reduction Initiative, we've been able to maintain safe roads.
Yeah.
But that's the most important thing. So, to clear the roads, push it off. Some of our monitoring programs, we have a lot of our roads right along streams, and we've seen the impacts, in our streams. But, unfortunately, there's not much we can do with that. So it's, again, getting back to using it wisely, using it more efficiently, and using that mechanical means to clear the roads.
I won't put this one municipality on blast. I won't say their name, but I did years ago. There was one that I continuously throughout the winter would see them dumping their snow piles in the Hudson River after they'd been treated, but it stopped which is a great thing, but never ever obviously dump snow in water bodies.
Yeah, you don't.
Absolutely detrimental.
And some of the things that we've worked with, and spoke with even planning boards on projects that are going through the permitting process, having them think about where snow storage will be.
Yeah.
Can it be in areas, low areas, where there's depression, so that when the snow melts, it can infiltrate. One thing is that you don't want to always take up your stormwater management areas.
Yes.
Because, as we said, about a third of the storms in the winter now are rain, and we want to leave that area for stormwater management. So
yeah. As far as the brining co-op.
Yes.
How do people join that? Like the workshop is going on by the time this episode comes out. That will have already occurred. But where can people go to find out information about?
Well, it is primarily focused initially in the town of Lake George.
Okay.
So it's focused for the town of Lake George, for residents, for businesses, for the resorts. In the town, everything is getting worked out, but the town appears to be committed to providing brine at no charge to residents, businesses, and people that have a business license with the town of Lake George and also the village, I believe, to utilize. So they can contact the town of Lake George, the planning department, and find out how to do that. After the workshop, we're figuring out how we can make this information public, post on the town's website, whether we can have that on the LGA's website. More information will be available. But and there will also be a waiver that people have to sign with the town to hold the town not liable for their use on private property, but that they will also have to go through a training process. We're not just going to give this to people and allow them to go forth and spread it without understanding how it's used. And that, again, is part of the reason for the workshop and information flyers that will be distributed.
For homeowners, will they need some type of equipment, technology? Like, will your average super soaker work? Like, how would, what's the cost for a homeowner?
Good question. We are thinking that it could be used through a kind of a backpack sprayer almost.
Oh, yeah, totally.
You
can get those at Lowe's.
At Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever.
$15.
Yeah. So,
that makes sense.
And you think about, typically it's about a gallon will cover 1,000 square feet on brining. So if you've got 100 foot of driveway, about a gallon for 100 feet. Just a rough kind of number to spray it. No, it's not. And again, it that's all that you need to develop that layer of brine that will dry, and then as soon as the snow hits it, it liquefies and then creates that barrier between the snow and the pavement. So also, if they work with a plow operator, we're hoping to educate the private contractors to become comfortable with brine. As we always said, it was with the municipalities, it was a culture change.
Yeah.
It really, you're taking something that people are very comfortable with, adding salt, and asking them to change what their practices are, what they've relied on for decades. It's a leap of faith.
We do it every day, though. Look at the boat inspection station.
Exactly.
That's just like part of the culture here now. Even like recycling. I mean, things seem really startling at first because people don't like change.
Yeah, it's a change, culture change of mindset. Yes. So
also cost saving. If you can get a backpack sprayer and come pull up to the village of Lake George, get a backpack of brine as opposed to having to have salt all season. Is there a charge for folks for the brining co-op?
It does not appear that there's going to be. I think some of those details are being worked out, but I think the town actually provides salt for free for people, for your own driveway or to help you out. So I think they're going to take that same approach. And they're going to see how this first year goes. Obviously, we hopefully we'll get a handful of people we'll get an idea how much they're using, how much the town has excess capacity and how they can provide that. And, we'll learn a lot from this year.
So there's a couple other things that the Lake George Association has, one being the Salt Summit. We've brought it up a couple times, but let's plug the 10th annual Salt Summit.
We're real excited. Thanks, Lindsay. It is going to be September 24th at the Fort William Henry.
Okay.
It'll be our 10th anniversary. And what we want to do is really celebrate the science to solutions approach that we developed, the model here. So one of our big projects we are hoping on this year is to work with our longtime consultant, Dr. Jim Sutherland, and develop a model of reduction in the Lake George watershed. So as we've reduced road salt, what will that mean to the lake? And we actually want to have a model that will project into the future on that. And we also want to tell a story through GIS on how the reduction has been accomplished in the watershed, in the town roads, in the state highways, and kind of map that out and use what they have as a storybook with GIS and lay that out. And we also want to bring in other organizations, environmental groups, watershed groups around the state, around the region, around the country, and talk about their successes in road salt reduction.
Right.
That a lot of it has started here in Lake George and rippled out. So it's going to be a big celebration. We're excited.
Yeah.
And was there?
Yeah, we also have Salt Watch.
Salt Watch, yeah. Yeah, no, that's very important again.
Which I learned about at last year's Salt Summit.
Yeah, Salt Watch is very important so that the residents can become citizen science, get attached to their individual sub-watersheds, and see what the influences are of road salt, of chlorides. And I think that's a great program that you can work with them. And I'm glad that you've taken that on. And, some of the things to measure upstream and downstream of a road.
Roads. Yeah. That's one thing last year when we started it, we were late to the game just because it was October when I heard of it and then, making the connections. But this is the first full year push. So we've already sent out to all of our salt watchers to, first of all, go out before we got any winter weather to establish somewhat of a baseline.
Right.
But also because we had no rain this fall, I think some of the numbers were a little bit higher because of evaporation, totally.
The interesting thing, and it's a little bit counterintuitive, but the highest concentrations of chlorides we get in streams tend to be in September.
Right.
Because of that influence, going back to what we said earlier, how chloride is conservative and it doesn't bind to anything. So at the time of the year when things tend to be the driest, which is late summer, early fall, you get the greatest influence of groundwater in our streams because we haven't had the rains. So the streams are at their lowest.
Yeah.
You get the greatest influence of groundwater, and that's when we're seeing those highest levels of chlorides, except when obviously we have a big winter event and they're putting salt on the roads.
Right.
And that's one of the studies that's a big unknown, is what is actually happening in the groundwater. We feel that it's kind of a reservoir. One of our studies that we did of the New York State DOT and their reduction program was along 9N and along Route 9. And we actually measured what in the streams, the chloride levels, and we did that every 5 minutes through our sensors. So we knew what was going on. And then we compared it to what the application rates were by DOT in these areas. And we found that it was 4 times higher, the loading in the streams, than what DOT actually put on in 1 year. Wow. So what's that telling us? That's telling us that chlorides are being stored in our groundwaters and leaching out. And that's a big unknown. And that's a study that we want to try to investigate.
To the corrosion we talked about earlier of the folks who have dishwashers and hot water tanks that are rusted out.
Yes. And, big studies done by the Adirondack Watershed Institute comparing wells adjacent to state highways,
Yeah.
adjacent or where they are not any influence from a road. And chlorides in those wells next to state highways were 80 times higher than wells that had no influence from road runoff. So I mean, it's there, and it's a problem.
Yeah.
And it's something that we have to deal with. But that's why we feel the work that we've been doing with the highway departments is so critical.
Yeah.
That's why we want to move into the private sector, and things such as the Brining Co-op, the Salt Watch will educate and make people smarter.
Well, we're fortunate to live here on Lake George, where we have done so much amazing work. And a lot of that is in thanks to our partners. We're going to talk with a few of them later today, those who sponsored the Salt Summit. But any final thoughts? Any people you want to, who can do better? You can be honest.
who can
do better?
I'm not going to call out people who can do better. I think we can all do better.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Like
we can all
general,
do better. Yes. I mean, it comes down to us.
I won't salt shake a path for myself.
Yeah, I mean, we can all do better. Again, we talked about our expectations.
Yeah.
You know, what we do. Do we need to get out there? You know, if it's bad weather, we'll stay at home, work from home.
That's right.
People telecommute and all the time. So give our highway departments a bit more respect. They are really hard workers. They're out there in these storms.
Yep.
Literally risking their lives, on the front line.
Yeah, because the roads aren't safe for them.
No.
Like, they have to make it that way.
They have to make it safe for us.
Yeah,
so
in massive
them.
Trucks.
And support things that will change, Work with your elected officials. Let them know your thoughts. Let them know that, we need to get more funding for these highway departments to get better equipment so that they can reduce the money that we're spending on salt. And again, we get back to that ROI. So, it comes down to all of us working as a community.
Well, Chris Navitsky, thank you so much for walking downstairs and joining us on the podcast.
It's great. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
We appreciate it. We'll talk with our salt sponsors or Salt Summit sponsors, and we just thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the work you do as well.
All right. And we will talk with our Salt Summit sponsors next. Thank you so much. Hi, Craig. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Lake Protectors podcast and, of course, being one of our sponsors for the Salt Summit. So how are you today?
I'm great. How are you today?
I'm good. We have some snowy weather out there, so talking about salt and your products is certainly relevant. So why don't we quickly just go through, you work for Hilltip. So why don't we do a quick little background on Hilltip?
Sure. Hilltip is a leading European manufacturer of snow and ice control equipment. We've been around since 2000 in Europe, currently export to 46 countries. We launched here in North America back in 2020. And here back in 2022, we acquired a company in Northern Indiana that builds truck bodies and things. And here a month ago, we just moved into a new 100,000 square foot factory. So, yeah.
And where are you based out of?
I'm actually based in Northern Kentucky.
Okay.
But our corporate headquarters is in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So quite a hike for you guys for the Salt Summit this year.
Yeah, a little bit, but we cover the continent right now. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. All right. So why don't we just go through some of the rundown of products? I know at the Salt Summit, there were a lot of products there as far as equipment people can use. Of course, certainly the municipalities a lot of folks are there to look at what you guys have. So why don't we just go through some of the products you guys have?
Sure. So we're most known for a line of what we call combination spreaders. This piece of equipment allows you to spread bulk material and also use liquid as a pre or post treatment, as well as pre-wetting. And we make those machines in sizes from roughly 0.8 cubic yards up to 8 cubic yards. And so, users can actually equip these units with pre-wet systems, spray bars, hand reels, so you can spray sidewalks and the like. Additionally, we'll make stainless steel units, a little bit more conventional application. We make tailgate spreaders. We make a full line of straight liquid sprayers, which range in size from 65 gallons up to 3,250 gallons. And then also, additionally, we'll build things like brooms, rotary brooms. We'll build push brooms. We have snow plows, misting cannons, and that kind of thing.
That is quite a wide array of equipment that you guys have. So when you talk about the sprayers, you mean like for brining?
Correct, yeah. But the nicest thing about Hilltip's equipment is it does have 12-month functionality. So, for example, somebody can use one of our brine units, for example, in the wintertime, and then maybe in the summertime use it for dust control, pesticides, fire retardants, that kind of thing.
Wow, That so universal year round. I mean, we certainly don't. Most of what our predominant usage would be up here, I think, is ice removal, snow removal, whatnot. But with a changing climate, that's good to know that these products are really widespread. Who are the products available to? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. And really one of the things that kind of really denotes us in the industry is a high level of tech. So these spreaders and sprayers that we're talking about basically have a tracking and control system on them. So users can geofence work sites. They can see application rates prior to going. They can automate the process when operators get to those sites, to the machines, automatically default to what you want it to do. And then you have a full array of reporting after that. So you can kind of verifiably, quantifiably go back, see what you've done, see if it's working, use that data to implement a better operational plan.
So you know exactly how much material is going on the road on any given stretch at any time. That's amazing.
And ironically enough, here in the U.S., as I always say, it was kind of like Space Age 1.0. A lot of the tech that we offer here currently, we've sold in Europe for a number of years. But we do have tech now available that we can retrofit to this equipment that literally will make the vehicle autonomous. So you just would need an operator driving the vehicle, and the machine scans its environment, deploys itself to whatever it's running into. So you may not need to be spreading at all if you don't want to. So,
Right. And there's certainly stretches of road. We talked with our waterkeeper, Chris Navitsky, earlier. And, in spots of the road where the sun hits, you might not need any application because it's already melted or it's already gotten that exposure where there's no ice. And then, another stretch a mile up the road might be a little bit darker. So there is that need for ice. So the ability to adapt and have that like smart technology is incredible.
Yeah, we actually this season introduced what we call our Temp Striker here to the U.S., which is retrofittable to any piece of equipment at any time, and it's live.
Okay.
And basically, it takes all the environmental data in real time, compares that against your historic spreading data, and then will give you a recommended application rate for that specific forecast, specifically where you are.
Wow.
So, so it takes the guesswork out of everything.
Yeah, truly. And wondering like how much should go on. So much work has already been done to try and get to this point. So it just further helps in minimizing the salt application on the roads.
For sure.
Are these products available to anybody? Is it predominantly municipalities, or is this like your average homeowner that could reach out to you guys and purchase some of these products?
Yeah, great question. So yes, they are available to everybody. We sell our products certainly through a network of distributors that are trained in the product. But yeah, really our two biggest markets are going to be, as you mentioned, municipal customers, as well as like contractors who are predominantly in the business.
That's huge. Up here, we've got the brining co-op that has started, but of course, trying to get that off the ground, trying to get the folks that do snow removal, the hired contractors, to be a part of it. It's not always easy. You have to adapt to these things, and certainly your guys' products make it a lot easier to do so. So we really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and of course, sponsoring the Salt Summit, and we hope to see you next year at it.
Oh, we've already got it on the calendar to be there,
perfect.
And hopefully bring a couple of other pieces of equipment with us to kind of show you everything that we do.
Chris just gave us the date this past week, so we'll be ready to go and looking forward to seeing you next year.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Craig, thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
You do the same. Thank you, Lindsay.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
The Lake Protectors Podcast is a production of the Lake George Association. To check out the work that the LGA is doing, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Lake George Association. You can also visit our website at lakegeorgeassociation.org. This episode was produced by Jacqueline Mignot. If you'd like to hear more, follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.